Good morning, everyone. Well, if it's morning where you are, we are here with World Builders 11s. It's the special event that we do every time we have a ongoing fundraiser. And in particular, this time it's the Geeks Doing Good fundraiser. We're raising money for our own capacity to keep on being able to be 100% pass-through charity. We're very lucky to be able to do that thanks to the licensing of works by people like our founder, Patrick Rothfuss. But it helps to keep the lights on by doing one fundraiser a year where we can do that. And we do that by celebrating with, first of all, lots of really cool stuff, which, let's see if I can point directly. Yeah, there it is, at that URL up there, igg.me/@/GDG21. It's a lot more intuitive if you actually look at it than if you say it. And also by having special streaming events. And I'm really happy to have this one in particular for a few reasons. Reason number one, I am a comic book geek. Comics are probably my gateway to that kind of thing. I used to buy comics for $0.25, if that gives you an idea of when I started. So we don't do enough comic book stuff here at World Builders, in my opinion. And I'm the executive director, so my opinion counts. Two, a while back, I was both a reader and writer for Medium, and one of the people that I really enjoyed reading on Medium was comic historian Thaddeus Howze, who is right here. Getting to talk with him is a great honor and privilege. And lastly, thanks to our work at World Builders with SFWA, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association, I got to meet and email with Tao Wong, who is an author of many different things, including The Systems Apocalypse, which is also now a graphic novel. And so he is sort of the bridge between World Builders' literary stuff and the idea of graphic novels. And also he can maybe finally clarify for my poor brain what lit RPG is, because I've never really quite understood it, and I should. So you can, that question's going to be coming your way now. But thank you both for showing up. I'm going to give a short biography of both of you, and then the questions will fly. So starting first with Tao, lives in Whitehorse, is a martial artist, training on and off for decades, studied many different styles, including swords, pole arms, and unarmed. Most unfortunately, like happens with age, when you do a lot of things for a long time, you get accumulated injuries, and life gets busy. He's also a huge geek, fits right in with World Builders. A former LARPer and Magic the Gathering player. We have playmats actually as part of our thing for the first time this year. Avid role player, board gamer, and occasionally video gamer. But like me, not a console gamer. Especially due to tendinitis. Again, isn't it sad when life gets in the way of your geekiness?
I know.
But here's a cool part. He started writing in early 2017, published the first book in mid-2017, and now is full-time in early 2019. And you can find a wide variety of his books on Amazon and other bookstores, as well as his website, which is My Life, My Tao, right? Is that the website.com. And then Thaddeus Howze, coolest job title ever, comic historian. That is awesome. Also an award-winning writer, editor, podcaster, and activist, creating speculative fiction, scientific, political, and cultural commentary from his office in Hayward, California. Speculative fiction has appeared in numerous anthologies and journals, and also 2 books, Hayward's Reach, a collection of short stories, and Broken Glass, an urban fantasy novella, starring the favorite paranormal investigator, Clifford Engram. As a good writer, also teaches other people how to write with a series of articles called Writing Craft, Mastering the Urge to Write. I also want to give you a lot of credit for the Good Men Project, which is not a unfortunately, it might be considered speculative fiction, but it is at least hopeful. The Good Men Project, which is a men's magazine that challenges social norms for men in modern society. And it has full of very interesting things. really, there is so much stuff in your bio, including the fact that you used to have an entirely different life, Thaddeus, and changed it to writing. I just want to go on here and say you've also appeared in numerous publications, including Black Enterprise, Gizmodo, Huffington Post, Polygon, Panel and Frame, and the BBC. So thank you both for being here. I feel like, given both of your bios, we could talk about any number of things. So we'll sort of try and keep it focused on comics. And I guess my first question is, and I'll let you, either one of you, decide who's going to start. But the question is, given you're both in very unusual, or shall we say unique life experiences right now, how did comics play a role in that? I can't hear you, Tao.
Oh, I just mouthed, wow, I didn't say
Didn't see that coming, did you?
That's an interesting question. I guess since I'm talking, I might as well. I've loved comics since I was like a kid. I used to read them all the time. And I started buying them, and I grew up in Malaysia, so between exchange rates and everything, comics were expensive to get. Single issues were like $10, the equivalent buying power. But I still pick them up all the time. Initially, I read a lot of DC and Marvel, and I fell in love with Sandman around that time. Death was just amazing to me. And I think to some extent that visual nature of how stories are built influenced some of my writing in particular, more than anything else. But I've been a geek since forever.
Makes sense. How about you, Thaddeus?
Comics have always been here. As you can tell, I'm still seeing. So I enjoy comics. I have always enjoyed them. I've been reading them since I was able to read. Literally one of the first things I think I ever read was a comic in the basement of my cousin's house. He was a few years older than me. He had some comics, and we would read them. They were old Captain Americas, Jack Kirby style, with giant hands pointing at the screen. It was always good. These were just great old stories. And as soon as I could figure out where to find comics, which I did, I found them at the spinner rack at our local food marts. And you'd go in there, and since we couldn't always afford the comics, we would just read them and commit them to memory. And I discovered I had a really good memory for stories, so I just read them all. And then when I started getting a little money of my own, I started buying them. But it would be years before my comic collection reached the horrifyingly large immense size that it is now, that has its own storage shed in the back.
I was going to say, yeah.
So, and I just finished cleaning that shed out, and my wife was looking at me going, wow, that's a lot of comics. I'm like, yeah, don't worry about it. You don't see it. Nothing to see here. Go back to your sewing.
Yeah.
Whatever. These comics are going to sit out here. They're not bothering anybody. Just let them be. And, so I've always been a comic person. And I started doing writing about comics probably 15 years ago, when I would go online and see people answering questions about superheroes. And I was like, no, that's wrong. And of course, that's the internet. It's wrong. It's the internet. So I was like, well, let me change that. So I would send notes in, and we would fight over it and argue over it. But after a while, I became the closer, because once I came to an argument and wrote my answer, that argument was done. There was no more argument over that. It was finished. So in the beginning, back then in the day, I was the closer. And then I decided that felt like just a little too rude. So I picked up the nom de plume, the answer man. And there was once an answer man at Marvel back in the 60s and 70s. So I decided I would hyphenate it and call myself the Answer Man, the same way Jack Kirby and Stan Lee said Spider-Man. So that's the difference between me and that old guy. And he was good. Don't get it twisted. That old guy was brilliant. But, I have a different set of sensibilities. I talk about race and relationships and story and history, and sometimes the writers and artists themselves. So I have a slightly different perspective, but I do have respect for what had happened before. So I acknowledge that he did exist, and people, I want people to know that I am not him. Because I actually had some old guy say, "Are you the guy that did it from the '70s?" I'm like, "Man, how old would I have to be now?" I wanted people to know I'm not that guy.
On the
But I
internet,
enjoy
no one
doing
knows
it.
your
It's one of
age.
the many things I do, and that's how I got involved with comics.
Gotcha. I'm also interested. We have a Twitch chat going on as well. I'd be interested to hear from the chat what kind of comics have influenced their lives and things. And that is actually my second question, which is probably I'm going to make it a little bit easier than it could be. It's the desert island question. You're going to be stuck on a desert island for the next 5 years, or there's a pandemic and you're going to be stuck inside your house for the next year. And you can only have one comic book title. Let's say we'll give you the series, and you can have as many things as you want, but only one title. I'd like to know what title you would choose to take with you into your time of isolation and why.
I'm good. I would take Neil Gaiman's The Sandman. It's everything I like in a good story. It's got diverse characters, epic origins, backstabbing, treachery, weird and random acts of kindness, sadness. I mean, it just spans an entire range of emotions. And even though his family is really dysfunctional, I relate completely to them because my family was completely dysfunctional. So I think that was the whole reason it really appealed to me, so much so that it inspired me to start writing. Because his writing was the kind of thing I felt like it just resonated with what I always believed stories could be. Because I'm a comic lover, but I always felt like comics were a little shallow and a little ordinary, and the stories pretty much felt the same year after year. And so when Vertigo started publishing their books, and they were a little different, a little darker, I began to really feel them differently. And after I started reading Sandman, I was like, oh, this is it. I could read this forever, again and again. And I bought the graphic novels, and I have all the collections. And by far, the richest series of things that DC's probably ever done. And I'm a hardcore DC comic fan. But Vertigo, and particularly the Sandman, has been the book for me. And if I had to pick one of them, I have to say Lucifer. If I couldn't get Sandman, then I have to get Lucifer, because what Sandman doesn't do, Lucifer does. So between the two of them, I'm going to sit on that island quite happy, rereading them, and I would not have any problem whatsoever.
Gotcha. And Tao, you went to the library, and unfortunately Thaddeus had already checked out Lucifer and Sandman. So what?
I was gonna say, if there weren't limited series, those two and Fables would be high on my list of things that I would pick up. But because they're limited, I would run out of things to read really fast. So I would probably pick X-Men. They were my first love.
That would be forever.
There's so many variations of it.
Yeah.
I could keep reading for a very long time. And I can rage over certain storylines that I've heard about that just make me go, no, that's not how the character is.
How many Wolverines can you come up with? I mean,
see, I'm not a Wolverine fan. I was never a Wolverine fan. I actually liked Cyclops and Jean Grey, and I'm boring.
A Cyclops fan. You're that's a small crowd usually.
Yep.
I sympathize with Cyclops because of once you're in, I think you sympathize more with Cyclops at a point where you become in a leadership position where you have to manage a team of various people, and you're like, oh wait, I see why Cyclops was always going. I kind of
yes, that sigh that he has. Yes, I feel that sigh. I've been a leader, and it's like
exactly.
Oh,
Luckily, I now manage a team that has no problems whatsoever here at World Builders. They are awesome, all of them, always to work with, because this is being recorded. Some of the comics that came out of the thing, of course, Sandman, yes. Karimshot mentioned Joe Sacco is one of his favorite. And then J.S. Hayden agreed with you, Thaddeus. but also said more modern non-superhero comics like Saga, Lock and Key, Monstrous, Wicked and the Divine, and Slice of Life with Cats manga, Cheese Sweet Home, A Man and His Cat. And Karim Shot likes Cyclops too, and Gambit. I'm actually with J.S. Hayden. Nightcrawler was my favorite growing up. I don't know why exactly, but probably the acrobatics.
Right.
The thing is, both of you, made deliberate moves to. Well, I mean, Tao, you went from being whatever. I don't know what you were before you were a writer, but I'm assuming you had some occupation before 2017. Then you decided to be a writer, and then you decided to make your writing into a graphic novel. I'm guessing that amplified the headaches of the complications of being a writer. So why would you do that to yourself?
I love comics.
Fair enough.
I mean, it's once I started writing and I made enough money and it became viable for me to do something silly with it. I was like, okay, well, what do I really want to check off my list? And one of it was, I want to make a comic. I've got this story. Let's make a comic into it and have fun with that. It really was that complicated for me. I wanted this for myself, not for anyone else, but because I wanted to make a comic for myself. And so I did it. I used to own a board game store up in Canada called Starlit Citadel. So I did that for like 13 years. So yes, giant geek.
Solid Citadel. Where was that at? That's not the Calgary?
That was based in Vancouver.
Okay.
We were mostly an online store, and so we sold for most of the years that we were there. We were an online store. Then the last 3 years before we closed, we had a physical retail store. But we used to do shipping for a whole bunch of people, and we had a YouTube review channel up for board games and everything like that.
Nice. And Thaddeus, with you, you had a executive position in the world of business and technology, and you decided to, obviously you took on several different projects, but it seems like, in spite of the fact that I do follow, the issues of rethinking toxic masculinity and things like that, I still first found you through your comic book commentary. So what made you decide to move to that?
I have an autistic child. He is now 17 years old. And 15 years ago, when he was diagnosed as autistic, we were told that he had no future, that there was very little that could be done for him. We should medicate him and keep him moving. There's no point in trying to do anything with him. Now, he's only 2 years old at this time. So took him to a couple of doctors. A couple of doctors gave us similar notations. And at that point, I was at my executive position, doing my job, loving my team. But it came to a point where my bosses decided that they couldn't give me the time I needed to work with my son the way I wanted. And so my choices, this is, when you're reading your favorite novel and you're wondering where that choice is, the character is going to have to make the choice that changes their life. And when you write that scene, will it feel real to you? And can you imagine anyone having to make that choice? Well, I actually had to make that choice. I had to say, well, I could have lots of money. This job pays really well. Or I could try and work with my son, who everyone says has no future. And when push came to shove, my bosses told me they would not support me, they would not help me, and that I would have to make it myself. So, having reinvented myself 5 times before that, it wasn't a big deal to me. I just decided I would do it again. So I started working at home. I started teaching my son. I taught college before, so I knew how to make a curriculum. And I knew a bunch of I'm a neuroscience buff because I too am autistic. So I knew there were things that I could do for him that I couldn't get anyone else to do. The people I was paying to support him weren't doing these things. So it's like, okay, fine, I'll do it. So my wife and I agreed we would I would change my career. I would spend more time with him. We would do more educating. And then one day she found something I wrote when I was in college years and years ago. She didn't even know about the closer. Closer was something I did back in the 90s. So she didn't even know about that. But she had found some of my old college notes. And she says, whose stories are these? And they're really good. I'm like, oh, those are mine. She said, why do they only get B's? I said, because I didn't write what the teacher wanted me to write. But these are really good stories. But those stories are not what she asked for. I wrote what I wanted to because I wanted to be in the class. And I wanted her knowledge, but I didn't want to write those boring stories that they were talking about. So I wrote these. She said, well, why don't you write some more? You got time now. And I was the first time since I was in college back in the 80s that she was right. I had time that I didn't owe to anyone. I didn't have anyone draining off the top best of my creativity. And so I said, sure. So I started writing, and I realized that writing was hard. I mean, I knew writing was hard. Don't get it twisted. But it's different when you're sitting down going, well, I don't have anything else to do but teach and write. And then sitting down to write consistently was different. So it took me a minute to warm up. So I went and did what I always do. I learned new stuff. I learned new craft, learned new notation, and started digging into it. And I discovered that there was something I obviously had been missing, because once I started writing, I couldn't stop. And so for the next 15 years, give or take, I worked on my son and I worked on my writing, and I became like a full-time writer probably 7-8 years ago. That's all I do now is I write. I write for publications, I write for spec, I write for journals, I write for whoever's giving me money. You have money, I'll take it. We'll write. And I really feel like I have something to say. I started working with the Good Men Project about a decade ago. And when I started talking about climate back in the day, nobody was interested because, well, there were so many more interesting things to talk about when the publication first came out. But a decade later, there's a lot less interesting things happening, and climate is more terrifying than ever. And since I was always on that circuit, I ended up becoming the climate activist for the Good Men Project, and I run their podcast called Climate Change by the Elements. We do it every Thursday, 5 p.m. PST. We sit around, we talk about climate, we talk about the challenges of climate, predatory delay, economic benefits and disadvantages, new technologies, anything that deals with climate, we talk about it. And that's how I ended up just basically shifting from being an IT guy, which I loved. I did it for 28 years. I love IT. My entire environment is still filled with computer stuff. But and I may even go back to it now that my son is 17. He's well-to-do, he's intelligent, he's capable. He still has issues, but he's not any like we were promised. And so I know that was part of the effort. So he's a good boy now. I may go back to it, but you know what? I really like writing. I may never do anything else. I'm okay with that.
Wow. I want to echo what is coming across in the chat. Just much respect for making that your priority. It definitely resonates with a lot of people who have had to make sacrifices or at least changes. I don't want to say necessarily sacrifices, but definitely changes to accommodate their families. So much respect for that. I also want to clarify, it was not that your wife had not been right since the 80s. It was that not since the 80s you'd had time to do the work that she was suggesting.
Correct.
Yeah, you said it was the first time since the 80s that she'd been right, and I was like, I think that was the other way around. Yeah. I just don't want you to get in trouble with her, basically.
No.
Yeah. I guess one of the questions that came up in the chat is, what kind of story possibilities do comics offer that prose doesn't? Is it the whole picture worth 1,000 words thing, or is it deeper than that?
Oh no, Dad, that's yours. I'm going to sit right here and drink coffee.
Okay, great. For me, I think it is really the ability to show what exactly you're seeing. I love comics, and I love the way that I like art, right? I can describe a scene, and I can give that same scene or that same character to 3 or 4 different cover designers or artists or whatever, and they will come up with something slightly different each time. And for me, that's what I love to see, is what other people envision. And some of it might not be what I think is there exactly, but it's close enough, and because it looks most of the time it's amazing, for me it goes, I'll go with that. That's great. That's what I want to see. And being able to some extent lock it down with art, with the pacing that comics do, whereas prose doesn't, gives you more options. Action scenes, which I love, are more, I would say, almost dynamic. You can show off in a page of a comic a huge action scene, which it would take me like a chapter or 2 chapters to detail. Or I can take a 1 paragraph action scene in a book and turn it into a full page. But that page kind of displays everything I need to say about that character, about how he fights, about how he's feeling, you know. So it's kind of a combination of that, for me at least. I adapted my work from the book itself. So there was a lot of things where we just took out scenes, replaced scenes. Well, not really replaced, but mostly took out scenes to go and streamline it so that I could fit everything into the 7 issues that we ended up with. So I didn't really rewrite specifically for comics. And that's something I'd love to do at some point. I have an idea for something else that is specifically for comics. And I think I'll end up learning a whole bunch of new things when I'm doing that.
Do you find that your experience in martial arts, like have you ever like given somebody something to draw and they draw it and you say, oh wait, no, that wouldn't, you wouldn't do that?
All the time. It bugs me when I look at a cover and I'm like, that person is completely off balance. That's just, no, fix this here, and that's fine. And it's often just minor variations because you can catch people half emotion or whatever, and that's fine. But that's sometimes when they just do it wrong and they're half off and they're falling, and I'm like, there's no way that this would physically happen. Can we just adjust this slightly? Just put this foot like half an inch that way and you'll be fine.
Yeah, it's funny how you go into things like that. I'm a former Marine, and so for me it's always when they're, you know, if they don't use good gun discipline, you know, I'll just go nuts about it if they're supposed to know better. But whereas my girlfriend, who's a horticulturist, will sit there and like in that scene in Red, which was a movie adapted from a comic, where he's looking at the avocado with the leaves. And he says, "My avocado has 2 leaves," or something like that. She leaned over and whispered, says, "Those aren't avocado leaves." You know, it's like you always find that one thing. You're like, why didn't you think more about this?
It bugs, yeah, things that bug you.
That actually is a great a segue to the other side of things, which is a question that J.S. Hayden had here. And actually, it gels in very nice ways. I swear I did not plant this question. But Thaddeus also teaches on Afrofuturism, and the title of it is Butler and Beyond, which in reference to Parable of the Sower. And the question was, are there, what did you say, J.S. Hayden? What are some of the pitfalls of adapting a prose novel into a graphic novel? It seems to be a strong trend recently with works like, which I happen to have on my bookshelf, Parable of the Sower, being adapted. And I should say I have this graphic novel after having read the literary novels, that's the way you put it, several times. I sort of stopped reading them on a regular basis because they're too scary now. But yeah, what are the pitfalls? I'm guessing, Thaddeus, you probably have some opinions on whether this is a good adaptation or not. And I don't know if Tao, if you're familiar with it or not, but other examples of adapting books to comics.
The hardest thing about adapting anything to any other medium in general, that's one of the pet peeves we deal with a lot as a writer, is that when you adopt something from, like, let's say I write a scene. If I write a scene, in that scene, there are things that I'm going to want to talk about. There are things I'm going to want to bring to the attention of the reader. things I'm going to seed the story with so that eventually an event that happens now will have relevance in the future. You know, loading Chekhov's gun, as it were. So these are things that you do in prose that you have to weave into the text, and you have to fill that space and time. You have to fill it with conversation, you have to fill it with machinations, you have to fill it with interaction. Comics don't give you all that kind of time. Comics are a visual medium. So what you used to be able to use a whole bunch of text to do, you must now use a single picture from a particular angle or a collection of pictures from a particular angle, streamlining that text to just the absolute minimum necessary to relay the data necessary to push the story on. Most stories that are converted from a story to a magazine or any kind of storyboard format, they're never as rich in terms of data, but because of the nature of the visuals, you might be able to get a different response. You might get different people, depending on the art. If the artist is really talented or the colorists are talented, you know, you could get an entirely different response. A section that might appear boring in the story might be amazing on the page. So there's always that loss, or what I call medium transfer. When you transfer from one medium to another, things are either lost or gained, depending on the skill of the people doing the work. And so I look at most stories becoming leaner, faster. Rarely do they become more difficult to follow if they go from one to the other. Now, I've noticed that when comics are converted into stories, they tend to be fairly lean. And it's because there isn't much to start with. So the person transferring them would have to write a bunch of extra material to flesh it out. So it's really strange. And I think I learned this from watching, I don't know if you know James Blish. He used to take Star Trek episodes and convert them from TV scripts into story scripts. And they're like, you know, wow, an hour worth of Star Trek is like, you know, 40 pages. So you're like, well, okay, that, you know, for me, that was a big deal because, you know, I'm always thinking about, wow, it's Star Trek, it's on TV. But really, when you just weeded out the script, when you just took out the text, all you had was about 40 pages of stuff, which actually makes sense since it's about a minute per page.
Yep.
So the average episode of something is about 45 minutes of. The story is only about 45 pages. And that was a stunner to me because I'd been reading novels at that point in my life where the novel was like 500, 800 pages, huge novel. So it's like, how many years would it take to turn this into a TV series if we were to try to take this many pages and convert them? It's a lot. So I think media transference is one of those things that when you're working in your medium, if you know it well, or you're used to working in both mediums, one and the other, you tend to do a good job. Look at the Clone Wars, the animated series Clone Wars, Fellini's Clone Wars. You can tell that he's used to taking what would be just a single idea and stretching it across a series of scenes to make an episode. And yet, if you were reading it, you know they would only be that long. So I think it's just a technique that you have to figure out how to use, and a lot of writers are still doing that. And storyboarding, I think, has gotten them used to the idea. That's why comics and storyboarding kind of feel very similar. If you're used to doing a storyboard, then writing a story for a comic, you can get that feeling for it. And so you know what you have to cut, you know you have to limit, and you have to depend on your artist to really bring that heavy lifting, because all that prose that you used to have is gone. So that artist has got to make the scene, he's got to set the scene, he's got to give you the visuals, he's got to make it majestic if it needs to be majestic, he needs to make it sad if it needs to be sad. You're depending on him to be able to do that. And that is a big responsibility for an artist.
Yeah. And dialogue, I mean, oh my God, we cut so much dialogue. And the more I worked on my adaptation, the more I cut. So I would say that the first parts of the comics weren't as good just because I didn't realize all of that, right? And I didn't grasp it to the same level. And as I kept on working, I was like, oh no, cut. That's too much. You know what? Just let's use an image here rather than, you know, whatever. So it was very interesting. And I didn't even do the adaptation all by myself. I worked with someone who was a professional at working out comic scripts. So he read my book, he put it, then I went over and read over what he did afterwards, because the initial part, just breaking it down, it's a skill set, and I knew I didn't have that skill set to begin with, and so having him transfer it, and then for me to learn that way was important, because I wanted to make sure it was at least good. If otherwise, I knew I was gonna mess up, and I learned so much doing that. But yeah, its adaptations are so different because, and what your protagonist, the character thoughts, because you can slip into thoughts with prose. You can talk about what they know or what they don't with prose. You can do world building with prose in a way that is not impossible with comics, but it often slows things down, or it has to be done in a very specific way. And so sometimes you lose a lot of that. At the same time, as I said, the picture tells a million words. I can describe a beautiful, alien city, or, one picture. It's done. I don't have to deal with any of that. So.
Yeah, and to some extent, when you put it, like for the alien city, like if you say it was an amazing Byzantine alien city, like I have a vision in my head that is different than Thaddeus's, that is different than people in the audience. But if you draw it and it looks like, there's the TVA, whatever it may be there, that kind of sometimes limits it. And like, oh, that's what it looks like? Okay, well, I guess that's what it was. Yeah, I also, I agree. I think, Thaddeus, I love the idea of not just that it's adaptation, but also expansion. Like if you take a movie like The Matrix, and then you have, the Animatrix, where you have different artists do different takes and tell different stories. Or I'm also thinking of, I was surprised how much I enjoyed the Firefly comics. Because I loved the series, dislike the director and creator, but love the series. And then found the comics, and I was like, what could they do that would be, it was great. I fell in love with the characters all over again, especially since you could go deeper into their stories. And this I think, one of the questions that came up from Crimshot is, has the popularity of the Marvel Comics universe changed how they're written at all, or changed what kind of stories people are willing to fund? And I especially, Del, I'm going to have you start out with this, because I mean, you write these stories in order to make your living. Did you ever go to one of the MCUs and, wow, this is what people like? Okay, I guess I better write something like this. Or and nothing wrong with that if
really.
that's we do this for money.
Not really. I do. For me, I went into writing basically as a fan in the beginning because I was reading a whole bunch of lit RPG and lit RPG stories, and so I started writing it just for fun. I had no real expectation to make money at it, and so I just wrote it. I finished up and it was like a couple of crazy months where I was just working and writing for between 9 or 7 o'clock to about midnight every day, just because I was having so much fun. And then I turned around, realized I had books that were finished, and went, well, I guess I should do something with this. And because I knew about self-publishing, because I've been reading Geek again, so I read about business. And Kristen Cratton Rouge has been writing her publishing blog about self-publishing and everything since 2011 or something. And I've been reading it on and off. I knew about self-publishing, so I went, okay, you know what? I'll just throw it up. So I got a beautiful cover created. I threw up my books and then realized that there were a whole bunch of people who were willing to pay to read. So I just kept on writing. So I've never really looked at the MCU, and the stuff that I write, lit RPG, really doesn't really have much to do, lit RPG and cultivation, doesn't really have much to do with the MCU superhero worlds. I think there is an appetite for, those big fighting scenes and everything like that, the visual aspects of stuff. But that's not really the area we're tapping into. Though it's interesting watching some of the new shows like Ready Player One, Ryan Reynolds' upcoming show with
Extra Man or Free Man or whatever it's
yeah,
called.
something like that. And then there was The Gamers done previously, and Upload, and all of these kind of Boss Fight. That's the other one that,
Oh
that
yeah.
came out, and they're all kind of mixing up virtual reality and game systems and everything. So it seems like that is going to be driving more of the adaptations and sales inside the lit RPG genre, and interest in our tiny little sub genre rather than anything like the MCU does for us, at least.
And the chat is reminding me that this is a good time for me to repeat that question I mentioned at the beginning. For those of us that don't know, what is lit RPG? Like, what does that
Um,
mean?
so slight bit of history because the term was coined in about 1990, no, early 2000s, I believe, 2001, 2002, by the Russians, actually.
Huh.
They were writing these adaptations of books where, about virtual reality, specifically in this case, where people were going in as full virtual dives into a VR role playing game, and so they were getting notifications of, hey, you're level one, you have strength 10, whatever. You killed this monster, you did plus 10 damage. You leveled up. You've got 200 experience. Great. Now you can go and get another class skill. It was basically adapting role playing games or computer games into prose, but instead of what Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance and everything else did, where they stripped out all the role playing game elements, all the numbers and everything. These Russians, Vasily and I can't remember the other guys, Sergey, I think, they actually left the numbers in. All of these stats, all of this information that you would see if you were playing a MMO was kept in there. It was listed and prose, and it required a slightly different writing method. You were telling people, well, what this sword does, what this thing does. And they had all the stats and all the numbers and all the calculations in the back end. All of us little RPG writers quite often laugh about the Excel sheets we have running on the back end for all the type of damage notifications and experience and everything else going on. But that's what lit RPG is. It's novelization of a virtual game or whatever, of a game system coming into the world. And so there's a bit of an adaptation between how much information on stats you're giving people and how little. Um,
So,
Have you ever
uh,
seen Sword Art Online, Greg?
I was just thinking, yeah,
yes.
Sword Art Online. I
Yep.
haven't seen it, but again,
That would
my much
be, if
hipper
you,
kids and grandkids like them. So,
yeah, if you were curious about seeing it, Sword Art Online and a lot of the animes
Yeah.
like
Sword
that.
Art Online, Log Horizon. So
There you go.
I'm a spider. So what? Grimgar of Ashes and
Overlord.
yes, Overlord. Even Konosuba, and the Japanese really have been running that as well for their ages. Korean manhwa has a lot of that too. Uh,
you know,
and even if you look at even before the Russians were doing that, um, Giant in the Playground, Order of the Stick, they've been doing that too in a comic format, actually. And I would say they were probably one of the precursors to this entire thing. They just never really put a term to what they did, which is what the Russians did. And
gotcha.
so the rest of us have just kind of stolen it and gone, hey, this is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that resonates with me is I'm like, I can't remember the name of it. It was an Andre Norton book when I was a kid, and it was when D&D first came out, and like the characters had armatures on their arms when they were in this world, and they had little dice in them, and I spent like hours trying to figure out how I could make one of those for myself as a teenager.
Yeah.
Or also Tad Williams' Otherland seems like it would
Yes.
that series would fit into that. J.S. Hayden mentioned apparently one of the Hugo nominees for graphic story is the comic Die, D-I-E. And would
Yeah.
that qualify in that idea? Um,
Uh, Probably.
Yeah,
I've read the first comic of it. It's It would be, yeah, it would be a lit RPG. It's kind of drifting towards the really non-stat-wise level of it. It's
Volume
such
2
a,
Split the Party apparently is exactly the one that is nominated.
It's a fusion. So you would call it partially lit RPG, but you'd also call it a portal fantasy. So
yes.
you get the best
Okay.
of both worlds because they are traveling between worlds. They are archetypical characters, but they don't use dice. They use style. The style of play dictates how each character interacts with the world, and sometimes it's really good, and sometimes it's really a pain. And the mechanics drive the game, but not always. So it was a weird. I liked it, but it was weird. It was weird even for me, and I like weird. And so I found it a little challenging to accept the mechanics, but once I was able to, and I learned the limitations of the mechanics for the characters, then it made sense. It just took me a minute.
Yeah. I think the tricky part really is that the definition of lit RPG is changing and molding because it's a made-up term. So, saying this is it is very hard, and it really gets into a very geek-oriented argument about what is lit RPG. Blah, 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 blah. No, you can't have this. Then we'll call it this term. We'll call it game lit. Or we'll call this progression
Internet's
fantasy.
for, we'll just bring in the closer, and it'll be, we'll settle it once and for all.
Yes.
Yeah. And by the way, for people who are listening or watching, you can actually get a taste of Tao's lit RPG because you've been very generous and allowed us to include some of your works in our digital goodie bag that for the first time we can give away during our fundraiser. I'm not doing a good job of reminding people we're doing this for a fundraiser. And you can see right over there the current amount we are at. Actually, I should refresh the amount, see if it's gone up any. If it hasn't, it hasn't. So we are we're actually $183 away from 70,000. Which would be very helpful to keep World Builders going. So definitely, please tell your friends, spread the word, and donate if you can. And if you live, one of the reasons we have the digital goodie bag is because some people are like, I have enough stuff. I don't need more books, games, cool geeky shirts, or whatever. But I do want to support you. And so, as a way of saying thanks, we have now a digital goodie bag which contain images, contain some graphic novels, audio, and basically various things. And the nice thing about it is that digital goodie bag can keep growing because we're not really limited. As we talk to people and they hear about it, like, oh hey, can I throw this in, and can I give you guys this to put in, and it'll be a lot of fun.
Yep.
So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So I want to get a little bit more into the not so happy side of things, which is that a common criticism of comics is that the way that they're drawn is such either over masculinized or over sexualized or just tends to contribute to unrealistic body expectations for people. And whether that is the Guns and Pouches era of the 90s, or things like that. And I find myself, there's the Hawkeye Project, which maybe it was called the Hawkeye Initiative. I can't remember what they called it exactly, but it was the idea of putting Hawkeye in the poses that most often the women were put in comics and things like that. Regardless, I'm curious just to know if either of you have any opinions about that at all, and if you don't, then feel free to say, let's move on to something more interesting. But I thought I'd bring it up. Any thoughts?
I'll take it. I try to think about comics the way I think about mythology. If you think about comics the same way you think about mythology, in mythology, everyone is bigger. Everyone is more magnificent. No matter what it is, Thor isn't just Thor. He is the god of thunder. He is loud. He is boisterous. He is drunk. He is vulgar. He is brutal. And when you're thinking about them in the mythology, you're seeing them as their most superhuman. They are almost always larger than life. the whole goal of comics is to fill in that slot. We don't have mythology anymore, but we do. We have comics. And comics are basically doing the same storytelling that you once would have accepted from legend and lore, except that now they're more human. They're more like us. The old myths included people who were like them. You know, they were hardworking farmers doing their thing. Occasionally, you know, they would tell a story about the, you know, a god of the earth, or, you know, Pan, god of festivity. And then if you were a soldier, you worship Mars or Athena, depending on your preference for war. All comics have done is give us new deities, new posing, new perspectives. Unfortunately, they're often hypersexualized because we all know that sex sells. I mean, let's keep it real. We sell everything with sex. I'm hard pressed to find something we don't sell. Okay, like, you know, toilet plungers or stuff. You know, think about the few things we don't sell. You sell with sex. Sex sells everything. Comics were a medium once upon a time that used to, you know, at least in America, you used to be able to sell millions and millions of them. Now, if we sell 200,000 comics in a particular run, we're like, wow, that's really great. So sex is, you know, this sexualization became one of those things that almost undid comics, but was also one of the great primary appeals of it, because people were repressed, and this gave people an outlet psychologically for that. And so I dislike it because I don't think it's necessary. If you read comics like Saga, or you read comics like Chew, where you don't need extreme sexualization to sell the book because, well, they're brilliant. So, you know, you don't need to do TNA because the stories are great. But comics that are more mainstream, there's less opportunity to be brilliant, and they're more of an assemblage of comic stories that we're just going to tell over and over and over again. And so it's meant for a particular audience. I think it's for 13 to 25-year-olds. And that's their audience. If you still read comics after that, you usually migrate towards something more intellectually stimulating. You go from reading superheroes to reading Constantine to reading Vertigo to reading Chew. You know, Meta Barons was my favorite. So if you're doing this, you understand that, yes, it's problematic. And I think some comic companies are starting to become more aware of it. I'm just not certain they're going to do anything right now because they're still trying to figure out, they don't even really understand their secret sauce. They just make it. They just basically picked up the secret sauce that's being made, and it says, hey, everybody's nearly naked, everybody's wearing skin-tight costumes, let's do this. But now I think they're starting to get the idea that maybe we should tighten this up and, you know, make it more about the stories. And so manga figured this out years ago. Manga goes everywhere into every venue, and they don't use always sex as their primary selling point. But there are plenty of sexy manga, do not be fooled. And plenty of sexy anime, don't be fooled. But I think that if we're looking at storytelling, I try to look at it like a mythology, comics in particular, that we're looking at godlike beings doing godlike things, and thus we are fantasizing about them being more than us, and they live in a world that is more bright, more colorful, more amazing. And then if we can do that, and it doesn't have to be rude and gross and overly sexualized, it can be great. I see many good comic writers don't have to do that.
Okay.
A lot of them still do.
Don, how about you? When you were making your comics, you had to make some choices, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, the entire system apocalypse thing is a post-apocalyptic world. So sexiness wasn't really, except for one character, who's a dark elf and male dark elf, Roxley, and he's supposed to be sexy. That's his whole entire thing because he has charisma up the wazoo. So, you know, it was like, you have to make this guy sexy because he's really sexy. But otherwise, it really isn't the point for my series. The sexiness isn't something that is meant to be there. It's more gritty. It's a little bit more dark. You know, it's a post-apocalyptic world, so it kind of trends towards horrible things happening. I don't show a lot of the horrible things happening, like Walking Dead as an example, but it definitely is in that kind of vein. The sexiness, jumping off Thaddeus anime and manga uh, point, it's just different markets, you know. There are so many different markets for different things. Like when I read Lucifer, or if I read something like Go Genius, they have very different feel, and the way that they draw and what they draw and who they're talking to will be different. I think the overtly sexiness is unfortunate. It's unfortunate, and at the same time, I mean, that's what I bought them for when I was younger too. When I was,
Yeah,
a 12-year-old, I was like, ooh, I grew up with Jim Lee and all of that stuff, so it was like, okay.
Yeah, I imprinted early on Red Sonja, and that never really went away. But I don't want to send the message out that there's something inherently bad with overt sexuality, but it is a matter of the market. We had an author on yesterday named Nhi Vo, who wrote The Chosen and the Beautiful, recent novel, and she is a little disturbed because it's being recommended on a lot of YA lists, and it contains a very explicit sex scene or two. And she said that when she talked about writing it, she said the thing is that if you're going to have a sex scene, it should be something that contributes to the character development or the story. It should be necessary, and it should also be there for the people should be prepared for it, so that they know that that's the person, that's the thing they want to see. It's always ironic to me that people get really upset about that one side of things, but showing the Punisher's family getting destroyed is never a thing that is brought up as should we really be showing this in comics? Thank you for that input. It's a tricky question, and I'm definitely going to file that mythology aspect of things. I never looked at it in that position before. Is it okay if we go a little over the hour for you guys both? Okay. I was very curious because we talked a lot about the story and the writing and dialogue and things like that, and touched on the fact that it is a visual medium. So I'd like to know, like, what kind of comics stood out for you that the visual aspect of it was either just made an impression, or that is innovative that you think more people should know about, or that kind of thing. Like what visually in a comic makes it really good?
Go on, Tao. I'm gonna sit here for a minute.
Oh God. One of the ones that jumps out to me in terms of visual is Order of the Stick, which is a webcomic, but they do have physical things. And the visual is very strange because he uses stick figures to draw all his characters. But and you can see his artwork adapt and get better as he keeps on working on it. But it's kind of amazing how much he can convey just using basically stick figures. And so and it's a very simplistic style because, again, stick figures, right? There's only so much you can do, there's not that much shading involved and whatnot. But he does so much with it. So I would say that is probably a very unique style in the types of artwork. The only other one that really jumps out to me is a Sandman comic. I can't remember the name. It's a Japanese one that they did. They had this Japanese artist come out, and I look at that work and then I just marvel at the beauty involved in it. But I'm sure Thaddeus has a million and one other.
What's weird about me in comics is I love the art, and then there are artists that I cannot stand. So it's really a bizarre thing that there are some artists who, when I saw their work, I was like, wow. So I'll give you an example. One of my favorite DC comic artists is George Perez. George Perez he's a beast. When he drew a comic, I wanted to read that comic, even if I loathed every word in it, because it was so beautiful. He gave you rich, evocative style. He drew amazing costumes, and his backgrounds and sceneries were always, they were three-dimensional. They weren't just there. They were in the room. They were part of the room. You weren't just watching a face. You were watching everything around it. And those faces were rich, and they gave emotion. And it wasn't overblown emotion. It was you could see sadness. You could see rage. You could see disdain, and he was good at giving you that. So I didn't really care what they wrote in the George Perez comic as long as he was drawing it. What else did I love? The early issues of The Authority. I think that's Mark Millar. I don't like him. But the early issues of The Authority were visually amazing. There were no other words for them. They were just amazing.
Yep.
Didn't like the artist, I didn't like the writer, but I could forgive it all for beautiful art. Now, that doesn't always mean that good art's necessary, because I read The Watchmen, and The Watchmen's art is, I didn't, there was no love lost there. But because the story was so good, I didn't notice. It's like, wow, I'm just reading and reading and reading and reading and reading. And I'm like, then I look about halfway through, it's like, I really don't like this art. I don't care, and I'm going to keep reading it. And it was great. Chew, the art of Chew, I love Chew, one of my favorite pieces of work. But the art of Chew it had to grow on me. It was simplistic at first. And it's deceptively simplistic, because it seems like there's not a lot going on. But the more you read it, the more you learn the shorthand of the writer and the artist working together to tell a story that was richer than either one of them would have told by themselves. And after a while, you can't imagine Chew doing anything else. And it's one of those comics I gave to my wife. My wife is not a comic book reader, but I let her read Chew. And she said, it's hideous. I said, just read it. If you can't bother looking at it, just read it. After she started reading it, she started looking at it. And after she started looking at it, she started laughing at it. And pretty much by the end of the series, she was laughing at every issue. She loves the art. She's pointing out the little bon mots here and there. And we were just laughing. And so when the series ends, we're like, wow, there's no more? It's like, no, there's no more. What do you mean there's no more? And so this is a person who did not read comics. So I believe that art can carry a story, it can make a story, it can break a story. But if the story is well written, you don't need great art. But a story that is beautiful, that has crappy writing, you won't remember it after you close it, because it's just beautiful. There's no there. There's nothing to make it stick. There's nothing to hold it in your memory. But Chew, for its less than ideal art, is incredibly memorable because of its art and writing weaving together to this new thing. If you've never read Metabarons is the perfect fusion of art and story, and thus it is, for me, one of those, if you've never read this, you have never really read comics.
What's the name again?
Metabarons, I believe? Yeah.
If you've never seen it, look it up. It's made by, I think, Humanoid Press. It's a European comic. And it is a story about a family that is unlike any family you're going to know anytime soon. And the story is told from the perspective of two robots who are talking about their person and his adventures and the things that he does. And they are more human than anybody else in the story, in fact. But the story is so visually stunning. It's so over the top. It uses myth and magic and technology and just good old fashioned storytelling. And for me, and again, I know I gave it to my wife to read. She's like, why are you giving me this? I'm like, because after you read this, you won't be right. She read it. She loved the art. That was what got her. She said, okay, I'll read it because it's pretty. I said, no, read it because it's good, but you'll understand in a minute. By the time we were done, she's like, "Is there any more?" I'm like, "You already know the answer to that. I gave you all there was. All there was."
Yes, it's
and
always
that's
so
all there
sad.
is, and you're just going to have to live with it. So it can be that beautiful art and beautiful stories are the most powerful combination, but you don't need both. You just need passionate delivery of one or the other. If you can get them both, of course, these become transformative works that will change how you see comics.
Talking about comic that fuse together really well in my mind, I can't see anything else. There's another web comic called Go Genius.
Phil Foglio,
It's a
right?
it's a steampunk kind of comic, and I cannot even imagine anyone else doing that series other than the people who do it, really. It's so iconic the way that they do it. And I love their little robots and everything else that goes along with it.
Yeah, and actually, that's actually a great example of what we were just talking about. Girl Genius. Like, I would never hesitate to give a copy of Girl Genius to anybody because it's just such a wonderful, wholesome fun. It's interesting. It's up there. But Phil Foglio also wrote, I don't know how many issues there were, but a comic book called Xenophile, which was all about explicit sexual stories. And they were stories. Human sexuality is something you can write stories about, and they were explicit, but it wasn't there to titillate as much as to write fun, speculative fiction about that. So the same person writing entirely different styles, but just because that's what the story called for. I would also like to shout out when people talk about great images and story going together, and I would also categorize this as just not fair, is David Mack and Kabuki, which he actually, the initial Kabuki graphic novel was his thesis project in college. And then it's unfair that one person could have that much talent in storytelling, art, and creating this. And then he went on to explore many different forms of artistic things like collage and painting and things like that in the future, in further volumes of that universe. So yeah, that definitely falls in there. Okay, so shoot, I had a hard question and it just went out of my head. And I remember I was going to frame it as, this is the last hard question I'll ask you. But apparently it flew out of my head, so I'm not going to ask you another hard question. Here's a question for you. Do either of you have a question you would like to ask the other person? And you can totally say, Gray, that's your problem. Your job is to moderate.
Okay, I'll ask one. How long did it take you to decide that you were going to make a comic out of your stories? And at what point did you decide that you were going to keep doing it even after it got really frustrating?
Oof. How long? I really actually don't know when I decided I was going to do it. It was probably a year or 2 years in, and it was more even a case of, do I have the money and the cost and the time frame to do it, rather than if I was ever going to do it. Because, as I said, I wanted this for myself. The second question for me to finish adapting the entire series, because I did the first issue first, and I went, okay, we'll throw it up and see what happens. It did not sell. I don't know how to market comics. It's not something I focus on. It's not something I have the time to. I make my money writing novels, and that's where I make my money. Having the comic was, again, very much for me. So it didn't sell very well. But I looked at it and went, you know what? I do want to finish this as a whole comic. And that took me a few months debating between, should I spend all this money on doing this? This is kind of dumb to spend money that I'm never going to get back. But I really want this. So, instead of buying a Lamborghini or whatever, and it didn't cost that much, I decided to spend my money on making a comic just for myself, kind of thing, more than anything else.
Did you ever have that moment that you were just going, oh, I'm done with this? Did you ever feel that at any moment? Or was it always like, yes, I'm going to keep doing this no matter what?
Um,
The only way out is through.
yeah, I think once I made the decision that I was going to do it after the first issue, and I just went, you know what, I'm just going to do this. I don't really care. I'm used to pushing through whether my wife calls me emotionally stunted at times. So I don't really notice issues like, oh, I'm getting frustrated. Everyone else around me notices that I'm getting frustrated. I don't notice it. I just kind of block it off in the back of my mind and I just keep going. Um, it makes me it makes me very good at getting things done. Doesn't necessarily make me a very nice person to be with at times. Also makes me a good. It also meant that when I used to spar, I worried people because they punch me in the head and I just keep coming. And it's just like, what? Doesn't that hurt? Eh, I'll hurt you more.
Persistence as a superpower.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or, too stupid to quit in my case. And not speaking for you, speaking for myself. That is an identifiable tragic flaw of mine. So the easy questions, we do this at the end of every one of our new interviews. We call it the lightning round.
But
And-
can I
Oh,
ask
yes.
Thaddeus a question?
Oh, that's right. I forgot. I didn't give you a chance. Go for it.
Actually, it's two questions. Simple. Where in the US do you live, and will you be willing to go out for a drink so I can pick your brain about comics?
I live in Northern California. I live in a small town called Hayward, about 15 or 20 miles south of San Francisco, east and south of San Francisco, south of Oakland. It's a small industrial town. Nothing much happens here, which is probably why I like living here. But it is in the center of the bay, so if I want to go anywhere, I can get there. You do not need to see me physically to pick my brain. All you have to do is call me or send me an email, and I'm available to talk. Zoom is for everyone, so you can always call me up and chat me up if you want to talk about comics. And that's kind of what I do most of my days, so I'm good.
Yeah, all you got to do is run a fundraiser, and you can get really interesting people you've always wanted to talk to show up. So yeah, you had another question.
No, that was the two.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
That's good.
Gotcha. Cool. So it's kind of funny. That was kind of in our lightning round. We just kind of want to get to know people just as people. So, pardon me. If you guys were gonna go out for a beverage of choice, what would be your beverage of choice? Doesn't have to be alcoholic. Could be anything at all. What would you like to have, Tao?
I don't drink. I can't.
Right.
So I generally trend towards non-alcoholic stuff. Bubble tea actually is one of my favorites.
Gotcha. Cool. You and my partner. How about you, Thaddeus? What's your beverage of choice?
I'm having my beverage of choice right now, coffee. Even though my English friends will look down their nose and say, "Hey, never would you drink that?" There are times that I enjoy it, and there is no substitute for me. I used to, when I was in the service, we drank a lot more coffee than I do now. Now I make 1 cup a day. But back in the service, it might have been 4 or 5 cups a day because we kept weird hours. We had to work late or stay up late, get up early. So, coffee became the juice of life, literally.
Yep.
But nowadays, I have 1 cup in the morning like I'm having right now, and that's usually all I'll need to get through the day. So, but I enjoy coffee as my beverage of choice. Like if I'm going to go out and have a work meeting, we go out and we have a cup of coffee or maybe to Starbucks. We'll hang out and talk.
Yep.
Nice. Okay. And how about if we said, hey, you know what? Turns out we could all go out for dinner. What kind of food would you like to have? Thaddeus, you first this time.
I love Thai food, so if we're going to someplace that makes good Thai food, we are definitely going to be in. I will, as a second choice, get good Italian food, but it's hard to find good Italian food. My wife is a chef, so we spent a while hunting for good Italian restaurants, and it took us a while before we found one in the Bay Area, and I think the pandemic put an end to that one just recently. So we'll be one day when the world is safe again, 5 years from now, going back out to find another good Italian restaurant. In the meantime, she'll just keep making great Italian food at home, and I'll just have to suffer.
Sounds like a horrible, horrible life.
It is a horrible life to live with a chef. You just you're eating good food every day, and you're just like when we go out to eat at restaurants, the first thing I'm like, I take a bite, I'm like, oh, you could have stayed home. And see, that's bad. That's bad. I mean, I'm in a restaurant. I'm like, I'm supposed to be here for the ambiance, but I'm really only here for the food. I don't care about the rest of this place. I live in my head. So I eat the food, and that's where the food lives in my mind. So if I'm in a restaurant and I taste it and I go, I could have been at home, I'm unhappy because I could have been at home and she could have cooked and I would have had a better meal. And I don't mind cleaning up after dinner. So, because that's what I do. You know, she cooks, I clean. That's our arrangement.
I mean, that is a fair arrangement.
Yeah, as long as she keeps cooking amazing food, I'm going to clean up that kitchen, and I'm never going to have a complaint.
That's a very good way of doing it. I was going to say you should just come to Malaysia and I'll drag you around because the ambience is not the question. It's the food.
Right.
My wife used to joke that I used to joke to my wife that you put two Malaysians together and about 15 minutes later, all we're talking about is food. And she didn't believe me. She really didn't. And then I brought her to Malaysia. And then after about a week, she looked at me and went, "You people are obsessed. You literally don't talk about anything else but food most of the time. Random people you meet, you just talk about food eventually." I'm like,
food restaurant. Yes. That's right. I remember.
Nice. Okay.
But yeah, I love food. I don't really care where I go. I will eat almost anything so long as it's good. If I had to choose, I often just choose based off where I'm located. Mm-hmm. But I love Chinese food. I love Malaysian. Japanese is good. Japanese food is really good, but it's hard to find good stuff. A part of it is, especially if you're having sushi or sashimi, the ingredient quality has to be good to go and make it good. And they can, I find ramen is a lot easier because you can make good ramen no matter where you are, because it's all about the stock and the tare, and that you can mix around and make it yourself.
Nice. Okay. Wow. I love the in-depth things there. Now I'm hungry. The next question, normally I ask people what do they like to watch and what do they like to read, but I'm gonna frame this a little bit differently because we've talked a lot about that already. But in terms of comics or graphic novels, what is a title or a particular issue that you wish more people had read? Like you feel like that more people need to read this or see this one particular one? Fables, okay.
I think of all the strange, offbeat, not on the main path of comic reading stories. I mean, I've already mentioned Sandman and Lucifer; those are great. But I think when I started reading Fables, it was so different. I didn't know what to expect, and I found that the more I read it, the more I looked forward to the unexpected. And it was one of those books that kept me going, oh my. And so again, I had the graphic novels and all that, so I gave them to my wife to read. And you already know what happened. She read them. In the beginning, she's like, these are weird. But by the end of the third or fourth book, in the original comic series, she's like, oh, these are better than I thought. You have more. I said, here's the whole box right there. Go nuts. And when she was done, she said, are they going to make more? I said, they're probably going to make more. These are really good books. People really like them. She said, I just didn't know what to expect. I said, yes, that's why they're brilliant. And so we fell into the story of fairy tales that we already knew that we didn't know that we didn't know. And that's what made them so bloody good. They gave us what we expected and then said, here's some new stuff, and completely changed the whole experience. And so Fables is one of those rare books that, having read it, I can't imagine not having read it.
Nice.
Much like the Metabarons.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I love Fables. Fables, Lucifer, Sandman. Those are the three main series I I have the full collections for Rat Queens.
Yes. And we sell them here, actually.
I really enjoy that. I like the way that they have the various women basically playing, your typical D&D party. Really, you look at it, but they're protagonists that you just kind of gender swap, but not exactly because they are very distinctly female. They're very, but they're just doing all of these things that you would expect, male characters to do in some ways in the first view, and then it just gets amazing later on. And I really think I don't know if they're as popular as they should be, but I really enjoy that series.
Yeah, we were lucky enough to have the volumes 1 and 2 of the collected works in hardcover signed available on our marketplace. For sale. We also have licensed a couple of T-shirts and a couple of prints of we have a poster of all the Rat Queen covers, and they're actually coming out with a board game fairly soon. They're
I did not know that.
Yeah, little. Yeah, a big fan of both of those, Fables and Rat Queens. 100% concur on that. Pardon me. Last question. I have a magic wand that looks suspiciously like a fountain pen, but it's a magic wand. And I can wave this wand, and any character from any comic you've ever read, or even one that you've imagined, can appear to have a conversation with you. Who would you like me to wave my wand and have manifest?
Def.
Yeah.
And she's knows so much, and she's so cool. I mean, I would hang out with her for 24 hours any day.
Nice.
Now, it's funny, you say that, right? But every year, I'm a writer. So every year, because I'm a weird writer, I have my annual letter from Death. I write this letter from the perspective of the Grim Reaper, that we both know as Death in the comic of Death. And she talks to us about all the things that Death used to talk to us about. The young lady that she was based on passed away a few years ago. I have a couple of pictures of her somewhere. And she's very much Neil Gaiman's writing and the art definitely caught her nicely. But I write this letter because I think a lot of times people forget why they're living. They kind of just cruise through life and think that, life is going to be the same way it's going to be forever, and you don't have to really put a lot of thought into it. And one of the reasons I write these letters is to remind us that life's not promised to us, and that we are ultimately cruising through life at the same speed, 1 second per second. But that second is gone, and you'll never get it back. And if you aren't using those seconds wisely, you find yourself wondering where the time went, when you have that moment that you notice the passage of time. So I write these letters to myself and to my friends on Facebook primarily to think about the year, think about what's happened, think about what they've done, think about the news. Sometimes I'll talk about the news. And the goal of that letter is to remind us all to remember to live, because it's so easy to be duty bound and focused on your missions and forget that you actually should be stopping to smell the flowers and talking to your kids and calling your friends or hanging out with your friends or doing something meaningful for yourself. So when you said that, I was like, yeah, I've had that conversation at least once a year for the last 5 or 6 years. And I relate to it because once I started having this particular conversation, I started looking at my own life very differently. And I think it's one of those conversations we should all have a little more often. So yeah, I can relate to that just fine.
Cool. So would that be your choice then, Thaddeus, too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like I said, I feel like I know her.
Right.
Because when I think about how she looked at, every appearance she's ever been in, you see them. And for me as a writer, I'm an analyst. I gather up information and I put it in my head. And so I can see her now having a conversation with me. And so when I have that conversation, I'm having it as if she were the writer. So if you ever find any of those, they're out there or they're on the internet, you can search them. you'll see those conversations, and they really will put you in mind of her, because she doesn't tell you to fight against death and dying. It's inevitable. You're going to die. The question is, how do you fight for what you believe in, what you want, what you love, what's important to you? That is the essence of those letters. But it's very easy to forget them if you have a day job. Or you're like I'm a care provider for my wife and my son, and so you get so hung up on doing this thing, you forget to live for yourself too. And that's why I have those letters. They're really important, and to remind me of that. And I think everyone should be remembering that, especially if you work 60 hours a week, especially if you don't get to see your family. At the end of your life, you're going to look back and say, "Boy, I wish I had spent more time at work." Nobody ever says that. What they say is, "I wish I spent more time with my family. I wish I spent more time taking care of the things I enjoy. I wish I found that trip." Those are the things we forget. And that's why I write them. And that's why, for me, 24 hours with her would be that kind of a day where I would sit and we would just talk about, am I living to my fullest extent? And what could I do to make that more realistic, more probable, versus wanting to versus doing it. And I'd like to spend more time living it, not just thinking about it.
I'm not sure I would want to bring her to life just for me, but I think Mistress Weatherwax from Terry Pratchett would be a perfect person to kick your ass into doing everything that you need to do. And, just having someone like her running around the world, I think would be amusing and better.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both very, very much. I posted links to your websites in the chat, but outside of that, where would you like people to find your work or your writings?
Go ahead, Dan. I'll wait.
Okay. I think my website is the easiest way to find out, because a lot of my work is what they call wide, so it's on both on most of the other retail sites. Some of my works, this is the main System Apocalypse series and the Thousand Li series, which is my Xianxia Chinese fantasy series, are Kindle Unlimited only at the moment. So they're on Amazon only. Eventually, I hope to take them off, but they're making me paying for the bill, so I kind of have to stay with Amazon.
Necessary evil.
Yes, sadly they are. But my website will be the best way to find all whatever I've written that is publicly available. I do have a Patreon for people who want to read my shorts for one low fee, for $1 fee, or if they want to read first draft chapters of work that has yet to be released. But for my publicly available stuff, it's still my website.
Cool. Awesome. If it makes you feel any better, Tao, we had Brandon Sanderson on the other night, and he said that if Amazon decided suddenly to drop him, he would be done. So if someone, to the level of Brandon Sanderson still needs Amazon, it is just one of those things that happens. And thank you. Kerimshot put your Patreon in our chat as well. And Thaddeus, how about you?
Thank you.
I don't have as many books. I've had, like I said, the last decade has been spent focused on my son and my wife. But if you were looking for me, you could find me on Facebook. I write every day. So the thing about me is that I'm always writing, whether someone's paying me for it in that moment or not. A lot of the articles I write are articles about comics, superheroes. So I work for, if you were looking to find me, you can find me on sci-fi.radio. I write for them as the answer man, technically. And I answer questions about comics, superheroes, movies, television, trivia, science. I'm that guy. So if you want to know the science of science fiction, I'm the person you ask the weird question to, and I try to figure out if there's actually any science in it. And if there's not, what could be in it if we were trying to do it? Because someone asked me, could you make the Green Lantern rings out of science today? And I'm like, no, but it would be interesting to figure out if you could. So, those are the kind of articles I write, weird side treatments. So you can find me on Quora.com. I'm there. I am the answer man. I am on Facebook, and I write every day on Facebook. I write politics, science. I am the cognitive dissident. I am a quorum of one. I am critical race theory. So there are so many different. I have a bunch of magazines that I publish on Facebook. So one of the things I do there is I bring curation, writing, and analysis together into these different publications on Facebook. So if you want to find what I do or see what I write or know me better, you can find me in Facebook. But I write on Quora, Medium, basically on the internet in general. If you do a search in Bing, or Bing is better than Google because I've been on Google so long, Google's no longer talking about everything I write. There's thousands of the pages. But if you go to Bing, you'll find everything I've ever written. And there's thousands of articles. Thousands. And that's not a boast. That's just, I write a lot. And on Facebook, I have more articles than I have time. Usually I republish one every day from last year or a few years back, but I always write something new as well. So I'm everywhere. I'm also on Twitter. I don't do much Instagram. I do have an Instagram account. I've been doing more with it because I figured out how to use my computer to get Instagram to work rather than my phone. Because I hate doing Instagram on my phone. But with my computer, I'll deal with Instagram again. So I work on Clubhouse. I'm pretty much anywhere that the internet goes. And usually I'm saying something that someone won't always like, but I'm happy with it. So, there's not like I'll ever be running around going, oh my God, I've got to delete all these tweets because I said something that people, no, I don't have that problem. If I wrote it, if I said it, I meant it, and I'll stand by it. And I've never seen anything I've written that I would go back later and go, oh, I didn't mean that. No, I'm that person. I write it, I share it because I believe it's true and that we should all be doing it. And that's how it is for me. So I'm everywhere. You just have to look for me. I have my own website, hubcityblues.com, and I have my own Patreon. So you can find me pretty much any place people are doing it. And if you want to become a patron of mine, I will worship you. Because patronage, I mean, this is how I make my living now. I mean, I'm a writer. So, between people paying me as a writer and people becoming part of my subscription service, this is how I, can afford to be home with my wife who has renal failure, and my son who's autistic. That is the nature of what I do. So every time you support me, you support my family and my creativity, because I'm never going to stop writing.
Well, and this is why I invited you both in. Our motto is Geeks Doing Good, and you both definitely epitomize that with your work, and I really appreciate you taking that time to do that. We are at $69,909 in our thing, so hopefully we're going to break 70,000 pretty soon. I appreciate both of you coming, and please do, people in the chat, people who are watching this afterwards, please do go and frequent their websites and their reading. The chat also thanks you all for your time, both of you, and we will, with that, start to sign off. And our sign off is usually a word. Because there's a delay between what I see and what our stream goes, we have to give a magic word and then we wait to see it in chat. I think for this particular one, even though we never mentioned that particular comic, the word, which is usually a variation on the word vivamus, the Latin word vivamus, we're going to call it supermoose. And we watch the chat to see when somebody says it.
To know when they've actually heard you.
Yes, and there it is. All right. Thank you both very much for your time. I appreciate it.